0659. October 25, 1944. The rain squalls are lifting east of Samar, and on the open bridge of an American warship, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland is looking at pagoda masts on the horizon that are not supposed to be there. Under his feet is USS Samuel B. Roberts, 1,350 tons standard, 306 feet of unarmored plate, thin, mild steel, no belt, no deck armor, nothing between the sea and her engine rooms but the shell of the hull. 2 guns, 1 torpedo mount. She was laid down in Houston, Texas, and delivered in under 5 months, and she was built for one job, to shepherd convoys and hunt submarines. The men who served in ships like her called them tin cans. 20,000 yards north, the battleship Yamato is working up to firing range. Behind her, 3 more battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. The heaviest shell the Sammy B can throw weighs about 55 pounds. The shell coming the other way weighs about 3,200. The Navy had a word for ships like her. The word was expendable. In 90 minutes, Copeland will turn his escort out of the smoke and run her straight at that line. And the finest surface gunners in the world, with the best optics afloat, will hit her and hit her again, and she will keep coming. The men on those Japanese rangefinders spent that morning trying to solve a problem they had never been asked to solve. This is what it was. 5 days earlier, on the 20th of October, the United States 6th Army had come ashore on Leyte. Behind the beach sat the whole apparatus of an amphibious invasion. Transports, ammunition ships, landing craft, 130,000 men, and everything they needed to stay alive. Guarding the northern approach to all of it was Task Unit 77.4.3, called Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Escort carriers were merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on, 18 knots flat out, 1 5-inch gun apiece, and their aircraft that morning were armed for infantry support, with depth charges and machine gun ammunition. Coming at them through San Bernardino Strait was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, with 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, a force that could make 26 knots and outrange Taffy 3 by 15 miles. The math was not close. It was not meant to be close. Nobody had ever planned for it because nobody thought it could happen. Here is the part Americans forget. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this morning and had prepared brilliantly. Their optics were the best in the world. Their night doctrine was the best in the world. Their capital ship guns fired an armor-piercing shell, the Type 91, with a delayed fuse in the base, engineered to punch through a foot of American belt armor and burst deep inside the ship. Their gunnery officers had trained for one thing above all others, the decisive battle against the American battle line. To spot their own fall of shot in a fleet action, each capital ship loaded its shells with a different colored dye so that the splashes came up pink or yellow or red, and every gunner could correct his own. It was a magnificent system, and it was built for a target that was not there. The ship steaming into the middle of it carried the name of a coxswain. Samuel Booker Roberts, 21 years old, who had taken a landing boat in as a decoy under Japanese fire at Guadalcanal so that a Marine unit could get out, and who did not survive it, and who was given the Navy Cross for it. His mother christened the ship. Their model worked until the morning it met a target it had no shell for. She was not a destroyer. She was not a cruiser. She was a cheap steel box with a turbine in it, built because the Atlantic was eating merchant ships faster than America could replace them, and the Navy needed escort hulls in numbers, immediately. So it cut everything that could be cut. Armor, gone. Speed, capped at 24 knots. 1 5-inch mount forward, 1 aft, 3 torpedo tubes amidships, and a crew of 224. The objection to the destroyer escort was not stupid. It ran like this. A ship this cheap will never see a battleship because a ship this cheap will be in the North Atlantic looking for submarines, and the fast fleet will handle the enemy's heavy units. The logic was sound. The assumption underneath it was wrong. Her captain was not a professional either. Robert Copeland was a lawyer from Tacoma, Washington, admitted to the bar in 1935, who had joined the Naval Reserve at 19 and worked his way up through a harbor tug and a patrol yacht. His crew were farm kids and mechanics and reservists, and for most of them, the Sammy B was the first ship they had ever stood a watch on. Brown Shipbuilding laid her keel on December 6, 1943, on a slip alongside her sister ship, so the same welders and pipe fitters could work both hulls without walking. She went down the ways on January 20, 1944. She was commissioned that April. 1,745 tons at full load and a fighting ship in 143 days. She did what she was built for. She screened. She escorted. Nothing in any of it prepared a single man aboard for the 25th of October. Of the 224 men who took her to sea, 89 never came back. A like on this video puts their names in front of a few more people. It costs you nothing, and it matters more than it should. 0716. The order comes down from the flagship. The screen will attack. The escort carriers are running southwest, making smoke, shells falling among them in colors, and the little ships turn north into it. Down in the engine room, the chief engineer bypasses the safeties on the turbines, letting the plant run past every limit the builder ever certified, and the Sammy B, designed for 24 knots, works up to nearly 29. The squall has passed. The sea is a long, low swell, and the air smells of fuel oil and the chemical stink of the smoke generator. 224 men are standing at their stations in Kapok life jackets, watching a horizon full of gray towers, and there is nothing for any of them to do yet but wait. Copeland picks up the microphone for the general announcing system. His words are in the ship's action report. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Then he takes her out of the smoke. 0800. A shell meant for someone else clips the Sammy B's mast, and it comes down across the torpedo mount, and for a few seconds the mount will not train. On the bridge of a Japanese heavy cruiser, a gunnery officer has the target in his optics. He sees a low, sharp silhouette, closing fast, bows on. His recognition manuals have no plate for a destroyer escort, because the Imperial Japanese Navy does not build them. So he calls it a destroyer or a light cruiser, and the guns are loaded, as they have been loaded all morning, with armor piercing. The Sammy B keeps closing. 4,000 yards, 2 nautical miles from a heavy cruiser's 8-inch battery, in daylight, with nothing to hide behind. She fires all 3 torpedoes at the cruiser choke eye and turns away hard. Her lookouts see a column of water go up and report a hit. It was almost certainly not a hit. The record does not support it, and this channel will not claim it. Now the shells start arriving, and the strangest thing in the battle begins to happen. They go through her. An armor-piercing shell is a hardened steel dart with a fuse in the base set to wait, 0.4 of a second, long enough to bite through a battleship's belt and detonate in her machinery. It needs resistance to arm. It needs armor. The Sammy B's hull is 1/3 of an inch of mild steel, and a Type 91 shell enters one side of her and leaves the other without ever understanding that it hit anything. Their shells were built to break armor. She had none. Read that back, because it is the whole battle. The Japanese were not missing. They were hitting a ship too flimsy to set off their own ammunition. But the sea is coming up around her in pink and in yellow and in red, and Copeland can count the colors, and every color is a capital ship that has him ranged. And an 8-inch shell does not need to detonate to end you. One tears into a boiler. The plant loses its wind. 29 knots falls away to 17, and the Sammy B stops being fast, which is the only thing she ever had. She is now a stationary target inside a battle line. Copeland has a choice, and he has about 10 seconds to make it. The doctrine is clear. A screening ship that has fired her fish and lost her speed lays smoke and gets back to the carriers she is paid to protect. That is the book. That is the rejected alternative, and there is not a court in the fleet that would have questioned it. He turns her back in. For 35 minutes, the Sammy B and the heavy cruiser Chikuma trade fire at ranges that fall to 1.5 miles, close enough that the men on the guns can see the flash and count. She fires more than 600 rounds of 5-inch. She burns through high explosive. She burns through armor-piercing. She burns through anti-aircraft rounds. At the end, she is firing star shells, because star shells are what is left in the magazine. The aft mount, Mount 52, sends 324 of those rounds by itself. Then the power dies. No hoist, no rammer, no gas ejection to clear the burning residue from the barrel between rounds. The gun captain is Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr of Chakotah, Oklahoma, 20 years old, married 11 days short of a year. He keeps the mount in action by hand. His crew lifts the 55-pound projectiles, rams them home with their arms, and fires, knowing what a hot, unswept breech does to a powder charge. On the 7th round, it does it. The charge detonates in the mount. Somewhere out beyond the smoke, a Japanese spotting officer is watching a ship that will not close, will not sink, and will not stop shooting, and he calls for another salvo. It is a battleships, and it is 3 14-inch guns together, and it opens the port side of No. 2 engine room in a hole 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. The Sammy B goes dead in the water. When they get into the wreckage of Mount 52, almost everyone in it is dead or dying. Paul Carr is on his feet, open from chest to groin, holding the last 5-inch shell in the compartment against his body, asking for help to load it. 0935, Copeland gives the order to abandon ship. She goes down at 10:05. 120 men get clear into rafts and floater nets and stay in the Philippine Sea for roughly 50 hours, with sharks, with fuel oil, with no water. When a patrol craft finally comes alongside, the crew cannot tell whether the black shapes in the water are American, so they shout a challenge down at them. Who won the World Series? The St. Louis Cardinals. The oil comes back. If your father, or your grandfather, or your great-uncle served in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the boats, in the armed guard, put his name, his ship, and his hometown in the comments. That is how a memory outlives the men who own it. Here is what the Japanese gunners were actually fighting that morning, and it was not luck. They were fighting a fire control system. That 5-inch gun on the Sammy B was directed by a Mark 37 director with radar on top of it, feeding an analog computer below decks that solved the target's course and speed and range continuously and kept the guns on a maneuvering cruiser through smoke and rain. Japanese heavy cruisers that morning were shooting with optics and hand calculation. Their optics were better than American optics. It did not matter. Glass cannot see through a smokescreen, and radar can. They were fighting a shipyard, too. The United States finished 563 destroyer escorts in this war on standardized plans in yards that had been building oil barges 3 years earlier, laid 2 abreast on the slips, so one gang of welders could work both hulls. Japan built none of them, because a navy planning a single decisive fleet action does not think it needs cheap ships. And they were fighting a school. American damage control was a doctrine and a curriculum taught to every rating, drilled on every ship, which is why a boiler could be blown open and the Sammy B could still keep her guns in action. Now put the 2 shells side by side, 55 pounds against 3,200, 58-1 in favor of the battleship, and the 58-1 is not the point. The point is that the 3,200-pound shell was designed to kill something that fought back with armor. Against a ship with none, it was the wrong tool, and the Japanese battle line had no other tool because their entire war had been built around an enemy that never showed up. Japan could not have copied any of this. Not the radar, which arrived in her fleet years late and in small numbers. Not the damage control school, which she never built. Not the yards, which had no oil to run at capacity and no steel to spare. Not the command culture, which had scattered Kurita's formation into a general melee by 8 o'clock that morning and never got it back. Kurita told American interrogators after the war what his lookouts had reported. His force, he said, was quite taken aback by what it met off Samar. Some of his officers thought the ships on the horizon were Japanese carriers. Others reported American fleet carriers, the fast first-line ships of the Third Fleet, and cruisers escorting them. They were looking at merchantmen with flight decks, 3 destroyers, and 4 escorts. The counters they tried failed for the same reason. Some ships shifted to high explosive late in the action, which worked, and by then the range had closed and the smoke had thickened, and the American aircraft, armed with whatever was on the racks, were making runs on them with no bombs at all, just to break up their aim. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the battleship division from Yamato, wrote in his diary that he feared the spirit of all-out attack at short range was lacking. At around 9/11, Kurita broke off and turned north. Why he did it is genuinely unresolved. He said afterward it was air attack, fatigue, fuel, and the belief he was fighting Halsey's fleet carriers. Historians have argued every one of those for 80 years and have not settled it, and anyone who tells you they know is selling you something. They were right that the ships in front of them were dangerous. They were right that carrier aircraft were coming. What they were wrong about was the size of the thing that was hurting them. Off their port side that morning, the destroyer Johnston had gone in first, alone, before any order was given, under Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee from Pawnee, Oklahoma, who fought his ship until she rolled over and who got the only Medal of Honor of the battle. He did not survive it either. Taffy 3 lost Johnston, lost the destroyer Hoel, lost the escort carrier Gambier Bay, and lost the Sammy B. In exchange, 3 Japanese heavy cruisers went to the bottom, and Kurita's battle line, which had never been touched by a shell heavier than 5 inches, went home. So, could a 1,350-ton escort do anything at all to a battleship line? Not alone, not on paper. And that is not what happened. Kurita turned back with Leyte Gulf 20 miles under his guns, and the transports and the ammunition ships and the beachhead were never touched. Historians still argue how much damage he could really have done if he had pressed on, and they should, because the honest answer is that much of the cargo was already ashore. But the argument only exists because he turned. The ships that made him turn were the cheapest ships in the United States Navy. The Japanese had the finest guns in the world and the wrong ammunition for the target in front of them. The Americans had a ship that should not have been in that fight, and a fire control system that let her hit what she aimed at. It cost 89 men out of 224 on the Sammy B alone, and 1,000 more across Taffy 3. And they died in the water over 2 days while the Third Fleet steamed north after an empty decoy. She sank no cruiser. Her torpedoes almost certainly missed. She could not have stopped them for 5 minutes if she had been alone. Their shells were built to break armor. She had none. American naval power was never a fleet. It was a system, and it reached all the way down through the yards and the schools and the radar sets to a 20-year-old gunner's mate from Chakota, Oklahoma, standing in a wrecked mount with 55 pounds of steel in his arms, asking somebody to help him load it. They found her in June of 2022, sitting upright and broken in 22,600 feet down, the deepest shipwreck ever located. The hull number is still legible. The aft mount is still trained out toward where the battleships were. She is the smallest ship in the deepest grave in the world, and she is exactly where she was pointed. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are more of these. More ships, more crews, more names that were never supposed to be forgotten.